India's constitution was designed to execute a dual revolution. Upon independence, the new republic had to guarantee political liberty to its citizens while simultaneously dismantling centuries of entrenched social and economic inequality. To secure political liberty, the framers drafted Part 3, Fundamental Rights. These act as strict negative limitations on state power. If the government violates your right to equality or free speech, you have the authority to legally force the state to back down. To address social inequality, the framers created Part 4, Directive Principles of State Policy. These mandate the government to provide public health, living wages, and distribute resources equitably. While Article 37 calls them fundamental to governance, it denies citizens the right to enforce them in court. Meanwhile, Part Three's enforceable rights operate on a strict taxonomy. Equality and life apply to all persons, while specific freedoms are reserved exclusively for citizens. This structural design guaranteed a collision. The state has a constitutional duty to redistribute wealth and reform society, but doing so frequently requires infringing upon the legally enforceable property and equality rights of individuals. The text provided no explicit mechanism for resolving which mandate should prevail. The framers intentionally embedded this architectural contradiction into the constitutional structure, placing tremendous pressure on the young republic's legal foundation. This pressure triggered a protracted struggle for ultimate authority. On one side stood the Supreme Court, defending the rigid enforcement of individual rights. On the other side stood Parliament, passing aggressive legislation to champion the social directives of Part 4. Resolving this conflict required an entirely new legal grammar. Over several decades, the courts engineered a concept known as structured harmony to stabilize the system. This friction required both the court and Parliament to continuously negotiate their authority, turning the constitutional text into an active site of institutional contestation. In the early 1950s, the Supreme Court adopted a highly formalist reading of the constitutional text. This approach peaked in the 1951 landmark case, State of Madras v. Champakam Dora Rajan. The court applied a strict literal interpretation. Because the Constitution explicitly makes fundamental rights enforceable and directive principles non-enforceable, the justices ruled that Part 4 must run subsidiary to Part 3. This ruling paralyzed the state. Early government attempts to implement affirmative action and land reform were struck down because they violated individual enforceable rights. Parliament reacted swiftly. Within months, lawmakers enacted the First Amendment, altering the Constitution to bypass the court's strict interpretation and protect their social reform agenda. A strict textual hierarchy proved normatively unstable. A developing nation tasked with lifting millions out of poverty could not function if its social welfare programs were constantly nullified by rigid individual rights. By the 1960s, Parliament escalated its legislative maneuvers to reclaim supremacy over social policy. The conflict reached a crisis point in 1967 with the Goloknath decision. The Supreme Court ruled that Parliament lacked the power to amend fundamental rights at all, effectively freezing Part 3 and blocking sweeping social directives. Parliament executed a counterstrike through the 25th Amendment, drafting a completely new provision, Article 31C. This was designed as a constitutional umbrella, shielding two specific directive principles: the equitable distribution of wealth and the prevention of wealth concentration. The mechanism of Article 31C immunized any law distributing material resources from being struck down in court, even if that law violated the fundamental rights to equality under Article 14 or personal freedoms under Article 19. During the emergency era, the 42nd Amendment attempted to stretch this umbrella to cover all directive principles, placing the entirety of Part 4 above Part 3 and threatening to render individual civil liberties legally obsolete. Parliament's aggressive legislative engineering brought the constitutional structure to the brink of collapse. The Republic was forced to choose between unchecked legislative power and the absolute veto of the courts. It required an intervention on first principles. That intervention arrived with Kesavananda Bharati in 1973. The Supreme Court established that Parliament's power to amend the Constitution was not infinite, rejecting absolute primacy for either the legislature or the judiciary. The definitive doctrinal settlement came in 1980 with Minerva Mills. The court struck down the 42nd Amendment's massive expansion of Article 31C, comparing the Constitution to a chariot resting on two equal load-bearing wheels, Part 3, and Part 4. The court held that the harmony and balance between fundamental rights and directive principles is itself an unamendable basic structure of the Constitution. The court reasoned that granting absolute supremacy to either side destroys the identity of the republic. A state that pursues wealth redistribution without rights protections invites tyranny, while a democracy that protects liberty but ignores structural inequality becomes socially exclusive. By defining these non-negotiable boundaries, the basic structure doctrine mandates a permanent dialogue between individual liberty and state welfare, ensuring neither is sacrificed for the other. Following the Minerva Mills truce, the judiciary shifted its tactics. Instead of fighting Part 4, the Supreme Court used the directive principles as an interpretive engine to expand and redefine the fundamental rights in Part 3. This strategy materialized in the Olga Tellis judgment. The court examined the right to life under Article 21 and determined its boundaries had to be physically pushed outward using the directives of Part 4. The justices concluded that the legally enforceable right to life is effectively meaningless without the right to a livelihood, as outlined in Articles 39 and 41. They read the directive into the right, fusing them together. This same interpretive absorption pipeline was used to extract the right to education from Part 4. The court read education into the right to life, an interpretation that eventually forced Parliament to formally amend the Constitution and create Article 21A, a fully enforceable fundamental right. Through subsequent rulings, healthcare access and environmental protections were similarly bootstrapped from aspirational directives into enforceable rights. Through this process of interpretive absorption, the directive principles provide civil liberties with the material depth required to function in a developing social democracy. The harmony doctrine imposes specific limits on state power, preventing the pursuit of social justice from overriding core civil liberties. Historically, the government used the Ninth Schedule to seal away controversial land reform laws, immunizing them from judicial scrutiny. In 2007, that fault was pierced by the I.R. Coelho judgment. The court established a rigorous rights test. It ruled that social welfare legislation shielded within the Ninth Schedule remains subject to review. If a law damages the core essence of rights under Articles 14, 19, and 21, it will be struck down. This ruling constitutionalized vigilance, ensuring that transformative social politics can never completely override the rule of law. The durability of this equilibrium was tested again in 2024, when a 9-judge bench of the Supreme Court ruled on whether private property qualifies as material resources of the community under Article 39B. The Supreme Court rejected a purely collectivist approach, ruling that while the state can redistribute resources, not all privately owned property automatically qualifies as a community resource. Instead, the court now demands a context-specific analysis for each law, maintaining the calibrated balance established 40 years earlier in Minerva Mills. The modern Indian Constitution charts a unique course. It rejects absolutist liberalism, ignoring systemic poverty, just as firmly as unchecked welfarism threatening individual liberty. This structural tension forces India's democratic republic to constantly negotiate the requirements of freedom against the demands of justice.